Hey guys, it is Friday at 5, and that means it's time for another edition of Pagan Happy Hour. So, welcome everyone. I hope you all had a great week. I am here, I got my drink, and we are going to have a really fascinating chat today. I have a lot prepared. We are going to be talking about the runes, which was very much a requested topic from you all. So I'm so excited to cover it today. And what we're going to be covering, let's see, we're going to talk about the history of runes. What are they? Where do they come from? We're going to be talking about the runes and how they are incorporated into the sagas and into certain texts like the Havamal. We're going to be discussing if they were used for divination historically, and then how are they used for divination today. And then we're going to end by talking a little bit about rune magic in terms of spells and bind runes and things like that. So we got a lot to cover. So I hope you're ready. And this is going to be really fun. I'm really looking forward to this. And if you are new here, and this is your first Pagan Happy Hour, welcome. I've been doing these every Friday at 5 Central for a couple months now, and they are a really great way for us to chat about a pagan topic. So how these work are, I will be looking to the side here and reading your comments as we go along. So if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share, any questions you'd like to ask, go ahead and type it in, and I'm going to do my best to bring your thoughts, your ideas, and your questions into the conversation. Another thing I should mention is I do have the video ads turned off for this. So if you are interested in supporting Pagan Happy Hour, if you do find this type of content valuable, there are two main ways you can support these. The first is through super chats, which I have enabled. So that's just the money button sign down below in the chat, where you can donate and then your question pops up really bold for me, so I'll be able to see it and definitely address your comment or question during the happy hour. Or you can join my Discord community. So in the link down below in the description, that'll lead to my Patreon. All my patrons gain access to my exclusive Discord community. We are currently, I think, 70 people and growing every day. I launched it about a month ago, and it's been so fun to chat with all of you all beyond just these Pagan Happy Hours. So if you're looking for a pagan community, I definitely recommend checking that out. It's a great way to connect with fellow pagans, and it's a great way to support Pagan Happy Hour. So now that we got that out of the way, let's jump into it. Before we do, I'm going to have a sip of my drink, and I want to hear from you guys in the chat what you are drinking today and where you are watching from. Let's see. I see a few of you guys chiming in now. I see some of you guys chiming in about the Discord community. Thank you guys so much. It's so wonderful seeing and talking with you guys on there, and it's been really fun to run it so far. So I see people chiming in now from all over. I see Poland, Minnesota, Slovakia, San Diego, Ukraine, Latvia, New Hampshire, Illinois, Tampa, Los Angeles, Turkey, France, San Antonio. So this is going to be a good one. We are really around the world today. So thank you all for choosing to join me on your Friday afternoons. So I'd also love to hear from you guys what your current level of experience is when it comes to the runes. Are you new when it comes to working with runes and reading about them? Are you an experienced rune reader? Let me know in the comments what your current skill level is. And I'd also love to hear from you guys how you started to become interested in the runes, because it is obviously a very fascinating subject, but I feel like we all kind of discover the runes in our own ways. So So definitely share that. And while you are typing away, I'm going to talk a bit about the history of runes and what they are. Before I jump into that, I do see we have our first super chat. Thank you so much. And the super chat is commenting, I just found your channel and I've been binging your stream. So glad to be here live. I'm new to this world and your content is so approachable. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that support. And I'm glad you find this content approachable. That's my goal. So when it comes to runes, one of the things we have to understand is runes are predominantly an alphabet. So it is a writing system. And yes, we'll be talking about how they're used in a magical context, but from a historical perspective, the main purpose of runes is as a form of writing. And there are two different alphabet systems that you may have heard of. So we have the Elder Futhark and the Younger Futhark. So the Elder Futhark, which is the one you're probably going to be more familiar with if you do any type of rune reading, that was in use from around the 2nd to the 8th century CE, and it consists of 24 symbols. And then later in time, you have the Younger Futhark, which became prominent at around the 8th century CE and contains 16 symbols. So most of the rune lore and rune magic and rune divination is done with the Elder Futhark. And then also, if you look at how to translate the runes into modern letters for us, to use in our own spells, that's also often the Elder Futhark. Now, there was an even older form of rune writing called proto-runes, but it wasn't a fully developed system. So another thing you should note, though, is that look at those dates, right? So we're talking CE, not BCE. So this is all after Christianity for the most part. And when we think of the Viking Age, while yes, some of them were still practicing pagans, a lot of them were in the process of converting to Christianity or were already Christian, which is why you often see a lot of combination of both pagan and Christian symbolism in artwork that features runes. And we'll get into that. But first, let me check your comments here to see what you guys have to say so far. Let's see. I see Lori is saying, I recently acquired some runes and I'm trying to learn them by pulling one rune daily. That's a great strategy for starting to learn about the runes. That's also a strategy I recommend for anyone who's trying to learn tarot, to pull a card of the day. Let's see. I see Graves here is saying, I use them often for spells, but usually don't read with them. Yep, a lot of people do tend to use runes for spells. They're really great for that. Jenna is saying that she's been working with the Elder Futhark for a while and has created her own wood set. That's wonderful. And like all ritual and magical objects, if you create them yourself, you're imbuing your own kind of energy into the object, thus, in my view, making it more powerful. Let's see what else. I see some of you guys are asking about which I might be pronouncing this wrong, but it's actually spelled O-G-H-A-M, but I believe it's pronounced Om or Correct me if I'm wrong on this one. And this is a different alphabet, so this is coming from the Celtic world. And it's really fascinating to look at. It usually looks like a straight line with slashes in it. And that was used by the Celts. Now, certain bind runes tend to look a little bit similar to that Celtic writing system, but they are two different writing systems made from two different groups. But that's a great question. And maybe we should do a future pagan happy hour kind of digging deep into those because they're very fascinating as well. Let's see. Okay. So One of the things that I got to do that I was super excited about is 2 years ago, I visited Scandinavia and I went to Sweden and Denmark. And one of the locations I was able to visit is Sigtuna, which is a really ancient village that features a lot of rune stones from the Viking Age. So the thumbnail for this video that features a photo of me next to a rune stone that was taken in the Swedish village of Sigtuna. And in that photo, you can actually see how you have the runes carved in kind of the periphery, but then you have a giant cross. So you can really see that kind of intersection of Christianity in that image, which is something you'll find in a lot of rune stones. And that's where we see the runes historically, on these large stones jutting out of the earth. And you can think about these rune stones as kind of like grave markers or a funerary stele or stone. If you decipher the runes, what they're usually saying is so-and-so did these great deeds in life and they should be remembered for this and that. So they're really just kind of a way to honor those that have passed. Let's see. I see Sarah here and also sent a super chat. Thank you very much, Sarah. She says, happy Friday, love your channel. What do you think about ego death / dying to self-surrendering? Do these ideas affect your practice? Great question. And that idea of sacrifice or ego death or self-sacrifice is something that is very much tied into the runes, which we're going to get into in a few moments when we talk about Odin and the written instance of where runes come from, at least in the Havamal, where through Odin's self-sacrifice, he gains the knowledge of the runes. And there's a card in tarot called the Hanged Man, which is also about sacrifice, whether that be your ego or sacrificing something, more like your time or your energy or, something like that. And the Hanged Man has a lot of parallels to Odin. That's one of the two cards in tarot that I do associate with the Norse god Odin, the Hanged Man and the Hermit. But yeah, that's a great question. And the concept of sacrifice is also oddly important for today. It's Good Friday. So this is when Jesus died with his own form of self-sacrifice. So this is a theme that you see not just in Christianity, but in multiple religions and cultures around the world. You can even think of Buddhism, right? Where Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama sacrificed his cushy life in the palace, where he was a prince, to wander out with nothing in the wilderness and sit beneath the tree in order to gain enlightenment and to experience that ego death. So you can't have an ego death without some form of sacrifice. But great question there. So yeah, awesome. So we were talking about rune stones and these giant stones that kind of function as grave markers that tell the deeds of those that have passed. And where do we get then, right? The idea of them having any type of magical connotation, right? If the archaeological evidence shows them as mostly used as a writing system, often on these kind of funerary markers, do we have any archaeological evidence to suggest that they were used for magical purposes or divinatory purposes? Well, not that much, unfortunately, when it comes to the archaeology. Now, we do have some literary references to their function as magical symbols, especially when you look at the sagas. So I'm talking about like the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, or even the Havamal. So there's many accounts in the sagas of the runes being used for magical purposes. For example, there's a section in the Poetic Edda where Valkyrie helps the hero by showing him how to kind of carve these magical runes into his sword. And the runes are all here in the Havamal. But keep in mind that these literary sources were written post-Christian conversion. So we have to take them with a heavy grain of salt. And let's see here. I wanted to read you a quick passage that describes the time that Odin first sees the runes. And the Havamal is a really great book to get if you are interested in Norse paganism. The Havamal kind of translates to Sayings of the Old One. It's in the book, it's presented as kind of a single epic poem almost, but it's really a collection of various sources, some dating back to around the 10th century CE. And what's interesting is they are presented as the words of Odin, so as if Odin is speaking to us. And I do have several videos down below in the description where I dig a bit deeper into the Havamal and what I find deeply valuable about this text. But the majority of what we know about the sagas, the Havamal, the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda, is coming from the Codex Regius, so in a medieval manuscript. But let me read you this short passage here. So this perfectly digs into that concept of self-sacrifice in order for Odin to gain the wisdom and the knowledge of the runes. So this is Odin speaking here, saying, "I know that I hung on a wind-battered tree 9 long nights, pierced by a spear and given to Odin myself to myself on that tree, whose roots grow in a place no one has ever seen. No one gave me food, no one gave me drink, and the end I peered down, I took the runes, screaming, I took them, and then I fell." So Odin was hung upside down by his feet on the tree. So when you think about a tarot card like the Hanged Man also hanging upside down, there's definitely a lot of parallels there, especially the fact that that card is also about self-sacrifice. And here Odin is saying, I hung 9 long nights. 9 is a very sacred number in Norse folklore. So if you're ever doing any type of spell using runes, the number 9, think about doing that in terms of writing something 9 times or using 9 runes. So that's interesting. Pierced by a spear, also very relevant to today, Good Friday, right? Remind you of anyone else who happened to be pierced by a spear. And then he peers down into this pool where he sees the runes. So the knowledge kind of the runes comes bubbling up from the water. And water as a whole is such a powerful symbol representing the realm of the unknown or the subconscious. Anytime you see water in tarot or symbolism, it's often tied to the unconscious or the unknown or some type of great mystery, which is why in the High Priestess card in tarot, you see behind the veil, you see water, or in the Moon card, you have this pool of water. So that's always something to keep an eye out for if you're interested in esoteric symbolism. Water is also the most feminine of the classical 4 elements. And traditionally, women were associated with concepts like divination because they were able to tap into that unknown realm. So that's kind of where we get this concept of Odin bringing the knowledge of the runes to us. And then he later does talk a bit about runes being used in spells. So it continues on with several spells that Odin talks about where he uses and incorporates the runes in really interesting ways. So we do, like this book shows, have some literary references discussing that the runes were not just purely an alphabet, but were also used for magical purposes. So even though in the archaeological record we don't really have much indication for that, we do in the literary record, but we have to keep a grain of salt here because these were written by Christian monks. So for the most part. So let's see. Let me check your comments here before we move on. Okay, let's see. Ryan has a good question. Is there a correlation between runes and the I Ching? So when you're trying to combine both Western esoteric traditions and Eastern esoteric traditions, they do overlap to a certain extent. There is, in my view, a kernel of universal truth about the world that comes through, and it's filtered through different cultural lenses. So yes, I think ultimately there is some tie-ins, and that's why you see such repeated symbolism, such repeated motifs and archetypes throughout cultures around the world, is that they're all hitting upon some type of universal truth. They're just portraying them in slightly different ways. But they are completely different systems. The I Ching, how you read with the I Ching is a bit different. Its history is obviously different, and the cultural perspective of it is a bit different as well. Let's see. Okay, just checking your comments here. Okay. So we now have talked about where the runes come from. Now, let me know in the comments, but I first learned about runes as their use for divination, right? Often people will cast runes or draw runes out of a bag and divine the future with them. And in that way, thinking about them kind of similar to tarot. But as I've learned more about the runes, I wanted to dig into this whole concept of using runes as a divinatory method and see where that comes from and how you actually go about doing it. So that's what we're going to get into next. So firstly, we're going to talk a bit about, is there historical precedent for using the runes for something like divination? And then we'll talk a bit about, well, how do you do it if you are wanting to use runes for that purpose? And then later we'll talk a bit about spell work. So the first thing I should mention is that, again, our information about this is quite shaky. Nowhere in the sagas are the runes mentioned for use of divination. So we did talk about in the sagas, yes, they're mentioned in their use of a magical context, but we don't really find anything about them really being used for divination or for telling the future. And also in archaeology, we don't have any surviving information, records, material culture that shows that the runes were used for divinatory purposes. We do know a lot about how divination was done among the Norse pagans. Usually there was a woman called a vova, and she was a seeress, and she would divine the future by entering into a trance-like state there was a particular stool that she would sit in, and we know she had a type of magic wand, and then she would enter into these trance-like states in order to divine the future. But there's nothing really that indicates she would be using something like runes in order to do that. So it was more of a form of like journeying. I do have a whole video about journeying. If that's something you're interested in, you can check that out later on my channel. So where did this concept come from, right? Like, we all have heard of people doing divination with runes. So where is this idea originating? And as far as I could find, correct me if I'm wrong, I see Robert Parker in the comments is mentioning it now. We are talking about the Roman Tacitus. And I do have a quote here from Tacitus. So the only record we have of runes being used for divination is from Tacitus. He was a Roman in the 1st century AD. So I do have a quote here where he is talking about divination, because here on Pagan Happy Hour, we can drink our wine and cite our sources at the same time. So let's see what Tacitus has to say. Oh, before we do, I see we have another super chat. Thank you so much. Let's see, the comment says, I'm new to this channel. I don't know much about magic, but I like your content, and I want to learn. Oh, and I want to learn only things I know about magic and witchcraft on TV. Yeah, so at least with this channel, my goal is to share content about magic, paganism, and witchcraft with you guys, and hopefully bring some historical aspect to it as well, along with just kind of showing you how to do it. So getting to Tacitus here, so he says, for divination and the casting of lots, the term casting of lots basically means divination. So for divination and the casting of lots, they have the highest regard. Their procedure in casting lots is always the same. They cut off a tree branch from a nut-bearing tree and slice it into strips. These they mark with different signs and throw them completely at random onto a white cloth. So we get a lot of good information from just a single quote here about how the Norse pagans did divination. So we know that they pretty much used tree bark as opposed to stones. So if you're looking for a rune set to either make yourself or to purchase, I would recommend actually getting a wooden set, even better if you can make it yourself from tree bark and picking a tree that is some type of a nut tree. Though you might have noticed one interesting thing here, he doesn't actually mention the symbols used were runes. So we know they took strips from the tree bark and put symbols on it, but we don't know what those symbols are. And unfortunately, we haven't discovered any of these in an archaeological context. So yes, it's maybe possible that those symbols carved on the strips of tree bark were runes, though there is some issues here because the timing's a little bit off. The Elder Futhark runes were used till around like 100 years after the time of Tacitus, though that doesn't necessarily fully rule out the idea. It's possible they were using runes at that time. We just don't have any archaeological evidence yet for that. Or maybe they were a form of kind of proto-runes or symbols that would eventually transform into what we now know as the runes. So we definitely know that they were using symbols onto tree bark as a form of divination as well. And I see we do have 2 more super chats. Thank you so much from D Marie 85 and Just Simply Alive. I really appreciate your support. Let's see, I'm just going to check your comments here. I see Graves has a comment about Caesar, who also said that Druids dropped mistletoe onto white cloth. Note the similarity in cloth and color. That is interesting. I did not know that about the Druids dropping mistletoe onto white cloth. Of course, a lot of what we know today about the Celts and the Druids does come from Julius Caesar. He wrote extensively about the Celts and the Druids, but unfortunately, he was a biased writer as he was trying to conquer those people at the time. So great comment there, though. I feel like there is some type of interesting cultural connection there between the Druids and the Norse pagans, that there's something there, and I really hope we do discover more information about that. So we kind of, went over the fact that runes as divination, the historical evidence is shaky, to say the least, right? So does that mean we as modern pagans shouldn't use the runes for divination? Well, I think we can. I think the runes are very valuable, and we do know from the sagas that they were believed to hold magical power. So even if they weren't necessarily used for divination by the Norse pagans, we do know that they hold some type of source power, I would say. So I think it's totally okay to use runes for divination, but do keep in mind that when you're doing so, the information you're reading about how to use runes for divination, that is all modern material that has been written in the modern age by contemporary pagans for the most part. There isn't really much historical basis for that. Of course, that doesn't mean you can't do it. By all means, please do. But I think it's important to share the history here, so we're not just kind of doing things for the sake of doing them. So, next, let's go into how to read runes, right? So the first thing to note is that the runes, historically, as we know, they were mostly a system of writing, so they were like an alphabet. But we know that they had some magic properties, but the sagas don't give us any specifics in terms of what each rune represents, right? Because each rune has its own name, its own meaning, interpretation, and these can be very deep. So where do these come from? And this is something I still need to do more research on personally. I'm not an expert here, so let me know in the comments if you have more details on how the runes developed their meanings. Obviously, it's something that occurred over time. I think there were certain medieval manuscripts that helped kind of provide certain meanings onto the cards, but this is not something I'm a super expert on, and I still need to do a lot of research myself on this. I always look at things from a tarot perspective because that's kind of where I started. And likewise with tarot, tarot did not begin as a divination system. It began as a card game that was played by Italian nobles. Like, the first decks weren't created till around 1420, but tarot didn't start being used for divination to like 1770. So, and since then, the meanings of the cards have evolved and changed over time. So when you think about runes, I'm guessing it's kind of similar. The meanings of the individual runes, like the meanings of the individual tarot cards, have evolved and changed over time. And then with tarot, you don't just study the meanings of the cards, you layer on your own personal interpretation and intuitive understanding. So just like with runes, just learning the meanings of the individual runes is just the first step. Then you want to layer on your own lived experiences and your own intuitive understanding of that particular rune to create a interpretive style that is uniquely your own. So that's something to keep in mind as well. rune lore and understanding how to read the runes is really a lifelong practice, just like any divinatory system. And it's something that you're going to develop your intuition and your understanding of the runes over time as you age and learn more and more. So for me, I am still a novice rune reader. I am still very much a beginner when it comes to runes. And I'm excited by the fact that I am a beginner, because that means I have years and years of knowledge to gain and learn about this fascinating system. So I'll explain kind of a basic way to go about starting to read the runes, but before I do, let me check your comments here. Let's see. Let's see, great comments here. I see Robert here in the comments is saying it's mostly reconstructed at this point. Yes, so when it comes to reading the runes for divination, yeah, it is mostly a reconstruction of the process. Let's see. Great comment from Light of Belenis, who says, an interesting component of using any divination tool, including the runes, is you don't need to believe in magic. They may be understood scientifically as a tool for accessing the subconscious. Definitely agree there. So when you think about the runes or something like tarot, they are just a tool for better understanding our subconscious. We're trying to tap into our inner knowledge, and often our chaotic brain gets in the way, so we use something like symbolism to help bypass our conscious brain in order to tap into that more meaningful subconscious insight. Let's see. I see we have another super chat here from Sarah. Thank you so much. She asks, do you believe in the individuals of other religions, such as Jesus and the Buddha, were real, minus divinity possibly? I feel they were social activists. Great question. So yes, to a certain extent. I recommend reading the book Zealot. I think it's by Reza Aslan, about Jesus, if you're interested in learning more about him. He was one of many religious zealots at the time. So he happened to gain popularity with his, preachings and his death, but for the most part, he wasn't that popular during his lifetime. It was afterwards, with Peter and Paul and the establishment of the movement and the church, that Jesus began to become popular. But during that time period, there were countless religious zealots preaching out in the wilderness. So Jesus was just one of them. And there's so much misconceptions we have from the historical Jesus to what we learn about in church. For example, Jesus was not an only child. Like, everyone seems to think Jesus was an only child, but no, he had brothers and sisters, and that weirds people out because people like to think of the idea of the virgin birth, which kind of complicates things if Jesus had older siblings. But yes, I do think Jesus existed. However, I do think a lot of the mythologizing of Jesus occurred much after his death. Now, do I believe that the miracles happened? I'm still thinking about that. I love the theory that Jesus was kind of like a magician. When you think about the magician tarot card, or an equivalent to Merlin, perhaps. Maybe more of a mythological figure, maybe somewhat based in reality. Just as how when we think of King Arthur and Merlin, King Arthur is probably not one person that existed in time, but represented a group of different leaders that existed around the formation of the concept of England. So that's possible as well for something like Jesus. Maybe Jesus wasn't one individual, but his stories came out of a collection of multiple religious zealots at that time period. It's very fascinating stuff. I am not an expert. I do not have a PhD in religious studies, so take that with a grain of salt. As for the Buddha, same thing. I think he did exist, but I think a lot of the mythologizing occurred, of course, after his death, and I'm more convinced in the fact that Buddha was an individual person, as Siddhartha Gautama, than Jesus was one individual person. But I'm still figuring it out. And then I see Sarah here has some additional comments. Thank you. She says, oh my goodness, the stories that were removed, Mary Magdalene, and equal Thomas, his twin brother, so much more mind-blowing. Totally agree. I love the theory too that Jesus meant for Mary Magdalene to create the church. I'm a big fan of that. I also really do like Mary Magdalene, and there are a lot of pagans that do work with Mary Magdalene as a goddess. So it's a good day to be talking about all of this, as it is Good Friday. So great questions. Awesome. And I see someone's mentioning here the Gnostic Gospels. Yeah, so if you want to get into the Gnostics and Christian mysticism and even Hermeticism, you can really fall down a fascinating rabbit hole that I highly recommend. But don't have too much time to get into it now. Let me know if you're interested in doing a future Pagan happy hour on Gnosticism or something like that. I see a super chat here from Tayray88 who's asking who wrote the book about Jesus you were talking about. I believe it's Reza Aslan, and the book is called Zealot. So thank you for your support there. But yeah, just reading from the Havamal, when we think about Odin sacrificing himself, being pierced with a spear, a lot of fascinating parallels there with Jesus, definitely. So let's see, we were talking a bit about runes and how to use them for divination. So you can use them for divination in a way that you would use really any other divinatory system like tarot, for example, where first you want to get yourself in the right mindset. So that means finding a quiet space to help kind of get you in the zone, maybe putting on some relaxing music, maybe putting some incense on. Some people even like to cleanse their runes with incense smoke or moon water. That's kind of like a more Wiccan vibe, but if that's your thing, go for it. And then usually, as we heard from Tacitus, runes were cast on a white cloth. So they were thrown onto a white cloth. So I highly recommend getting one of those, though of course you don't have to. Usually, you have runes in a bag or a cup of some kind. You might shake them or hold them while you're thinking about your question. Now, when it comes to spreads, there are different ways to do this. Obviously, as we mentioned, none of this has a basis in history exactly. It's all kind of more newly created. But there are a ton of rune spreads that you can find online. You can just type it into Pinterest and you'll find a ton. The 3 Norn spread is very popular. It's kind of a variation on a past, present, future spread where you would cast 3 runes onto the cloth, rune 1 representing past, rune 2 representing present, rune 3 representing future. And then you'd probably, want a book if you are new here with rune reading to kind of explain the interpretation so that you can kind of fully understand how these 3 runes are connecting and how they might give you some insight on the past, present, and future. I see we have another super chat here from Melissa, thank you very much, who asks, can you explain to me your beliefs behind reverse tarot cards? Great question. So you can read reversals in tarot or in runes. So that would mean in a rune context, say you cast 3 runes onto your cloth and they appear backwards. Or when you're doing a tarot reading, say you've shuffled in kind of like a go fish style, right? So some cards might end up right side up and then some kind of reversed. That's how you would read reversals. Now, my personal opinion on reversals, I don't like to do reversals. And I think about this mostly in a tarot context. But when I read tarot, I believe that each individual card has both positive and negative connotations. It can be pulled in different directions in terms of the interpretation. And I choose what direction or what aspect of the card to bring out, whether that's positive or negative, whether that's inward or outward. I choose that based on two factors. My intuition, so what gut feeling did I get when I pulled that card or that rune? If I felt like sick or nauseous or weird, I might pull that interpretation a bit more of a negative way. Or if I felt more optimistic, I might pull that interpretation in a more positive way. So I use my intuition, and then I also use the context of the other cards, or in a runic situation, the context of the other runes. So if you're doing a 3 tarot card spread, I'll look at the other 2. Are they kind of more positive, negative? That might affect my interpretation, or for runes, likewise. So I use the context of the additional cards, and I use my intuition to help guide my interpretation, but no, I don't read reversals. So when I shuffle like you would a playing card deck, so that they will all appear right side up. Now with runes, you won't be able to like shuffle them. You'll have to shake the bag, right? so yeah, some will appear upside down, but I would read them just as I would normally, but listen to my intuitive understanding to help bring additional context to my interpretation. Great question. Let's see here. So I mentioned the 3 Norn spread. Obviously, the most simplest way to start rune reading is a single rune of the day type thing. So you have your bag of runes, you have your white cloth, you put yourself in a calm mindset, maybe put some music on, draw your rune, and then spend some time. First, do that intuitive gut check. You know, like when you pulled it, how did you feel? Before you even look up the interpretation and the meaning, write that down. I always recommend keeping a journal or a grimoire, book of shadows, whatever you want to call it. I always recommend keeping one. Write down your gut check, your intuition there on what you feel about that rune, and then go look it up. See what the interpretation is, and then you have that whole day to kind of think about that rune's meaning and see if it, you know, had any connection to what occurred in your day, or if it affected your mindset in any way. And then at the end of the day, write your reflections in your journal. So that's a great thing to do if you're just starting out with the runes. You want to spend some time getting to know them, to get comfortable with them, to learn about their meanings and interpretations. I highly recommend that. Of course, there are much more complex rune spreads you can look up online when you're ready to advance to the next step. So that is rune reading for divination in a nutshell. Of course, it gets, complex. People spend their lifetimes learning how to read runes, and I am not an expert in rune reading for divination. Tarot is much more my vibe. Which also brings to mind, a couple people asked in my Discord about tarot verse runes. What would you recommend? What is better for certain questions? And they are very different divination systems. While you might read with them in a similar way, where you're kind of pulling them out, using your intuition, and then using your knowledge of the meanings to interpret, I do view them as quite a bit different. The runes, their individual meanings are a bit more vague and philosophical. So they're very deep and meaningful. And that's good, but it can be tricky for more practical questions. Whereas tarot, due to the amount of symbolism in each individual card, tarot is uniquely positioned for giving guidance on a wide variety of both spiritual and practical advice. So tarot is unique in that there's two parts of it, right? You have the major arcana and you have the minor arcana. You have the major arcana that are these archetypes, these 22 sacred archetypes that help you on your wider journey, that can give you insights into your destiny and your spiritual path and what lies ahead. And then you have the minor arcana, the rest. I think it's like 56. Divided into 4 suits. Each suit is associated with a different aspect of your life, and each of them can be very practical. They can help you solve issues that are still really relevant for our modern lives, which is fascinating considering that tarot originated in like the 1400s, but you can still use those same symbols to provide a lot of great guidance into our modern day-to-day lives. It's still so relevant. But runes are deep. They are highly spiritual. They are very much connected to the sagas and the gods. So I prefer to use runes for spell work and tarot for divination. Though sometimes I use tarot for divination and sometimes I use runes or sometimes I use tarot for spell work and sometimes I use runes for divination. Last Tuesday, I did my first tarot workshop. I'm doing Tarot Tuesdays at 2. So every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Central on Instagram, I'm doing a free tarot workshop. And last Tuesday, we dug into tarot spells. So I think tarot can very much be used for spell work. And in that workshop, I gave advice on how to use different cards for different types of spells and how to incorporate chaos magic. So how to do sigil work with tarot. Now you can do something quite similar with runes, which is what we're going to get into next. How to use runes in a spell work or a magical context. So let me check your questions here and then we'll dive into some spells. Let's see. I see some of you guys are giving some book recommendations in the comments. Thank you so much. I am still new to rune lore, so keep that in mind. I recommend a couple books here. The first one, Futhark, A Handbook of Rune Magic by Edred Thorson. That's EDREDTHORSSON. And then also from that same author, Runecaster's Handbook. And then I also recommend Nordic Runes. But I'm still brand new, to learning runes as a divinatory system. So keep my book recommendations with a grain of salt. I'm sure I'm going to have better ones in a year or two. But thank you all, those of you in the comments that are sharing your book recommendations. Let's see. I see Robert here has a great comment that runes have a deeper connection to nature. That's why tarot is a more convenient divination system. That's an interesting point, that runes are very much tied to the natural world. Great comment there. So let's see. Okay, so spell work. Let me know in the comments, have you done any spells with runes? I'd love to hear. So let's break down what a spell is. And I do have a video on my channel. It's titled something like How Do Spells Work, which gives my own kind of philosophical concepts on what are spells and how do they work. But basically it's an intention that you are projecting outward into the universe. And you can do this a number of different ways. of course, yes, there are historic spells that you can try out. I very much like to research historic spells, and I'm really into recreating some of them, which is easier said than done. But there's also, because it's an intention-based thing, you can create your own spells, which is the main way people do spells, which is totally fine. They're not necessarily more powerful if they do have historical precedence than ones you create yourself. I'm just kind of a nerd about it. So, but when you think about spells as just your intentions being projected out into the universe, then you can kind of play around with a lot, right? So, for example, say you want to do a spell to get a new job. Well, you probably want to get yourself in the right mindset, just as you would for divination. So, trying to clear your space, your mind as much as possible so that you can focus on that intention very clearly. Then you can, do any type of magic. Say you're doing a candle spell. Let's start simple, right? So you have your candle, and we want to add in correspondences that connect with our intention. So what are some correspondences that might connect with the intention of getting a new job? Well, jobs are kind of career-based, monetary-based. Let's maybe choose a green candle. So we're having that color correspondence there. Maybe green is associated with Venus, and Venus is the goddess connected to the date of Friday, which is today. So maybe you do the spell on a Friday, or you do it on a day that's auspicious astrologically. Maybe you do it kind of starting at the new moon. So as the moon becomes full, that's when your job prospects are starting to arrive. And then at the full moon, that can be that point where you receive that acceptance for that new position. So you can add on astrological times, correspondences if you want. It gets really advanced. You can do like certain hours of the day are connected to different deities. You don't have to do all of that, but I like to pick one or two correspondences to enhance the spell. So say this is a candle spell. Say we got our green candle. Let's add some tarot cards. Why not? So say it's a new job spell. Let's add some tarot cards to help focus our intention. What cards would be good for that? Let's see. Ace of Pentacles, definitely. Aces represent beginnings. Pentacles, the suit of earth, associated with topics like career, growth, finance, wealth. Ace of Pentacles would be a good one. King of Pentacles, also a great one to put on there, representing the height of your abilities, of your skill sets, being the king of your domain when it comes to your career aspirations. Let's lay down those two cards next to your green candle. Finally, let's add a little rune magic, right? So what rune could we use to help enhance this new job spell? For a topic like this, I might use the Fehu rune. It's Fehu, which usually represents wealth earned through hard work. So I would carve that rune onto the candle. So now we have that rune carved onto the candle. We got a couple other correspondences. We got some tarot cards. We got the picking a certain astrological time that makes sense for that type of spell. We have ourselves in the right mindset, in a nice space to perform the spell. And then we sit there with the candle. If you're coming from a Wiccan perspective, you might want to like cast a circle, call on the elements, things like that. You don't have to. And then we focus on projecting our intention out into the universe. So we light it, we're meditating, maybe we're even singing, dancing to raise that energy. If you want, you can even burn some incense. Cinnamon is associated with prosperity. That would be a good one to burn, a cinnamon incense. So really these correspondences, all they're doing is they are enhancing our intention. And then after you've raised that energy and you feel that it's reached its climax, then you can, at that point, stop, and you kind of have to just forget the spell. You don't want to fixate on it. You don't want it to keep running it through your mind, because that's going to remove its power in a way. So that's basically just a very simple way that you could use a rune in spell work as an additional correspondence that you're layering on to your intention. I see some of you guys are mentioning bind runes and carving them onto candles, or using bind runes as kind of a magic sigil. And yes, that is definitely something you can do. So what are bind runes? Well, bind runes are basically a combination of 2 or more runes. You're probably all familiar with a bind rune without realizing it. The Bluetooth symbol that you see on your computers right now, that is a bind rune. It's combining 2 different runes, and it's representing Harold Bluetooth, who was a prominent Scandinavian leader, but it's made up of 2 different runic symbols. So sometimes you see them on a long line, where you might have several runes kind of written onto that line, almost similar to the Celtic Om writing system in the way that that looks. So you can create a bind rune that way. You also have, when you look at those runic funerary stones, all the way back to our earlier conversation where we're talking about Sigtuna and stuff like that, you see bind runes as well, kind of just written in a line, but not necessarily connected to each other in the same way. Now, I should mention that there are some instances of bind runes being used historically. They are rare, and they were more ornamental. There's nothing necessarily indicating that these bind runes, where you're combining a couple different runes together into one sigil, were used for magic purposes. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means we don't have any current, archaeological or literary evidence for bind runes being used for that purpose. It was kind of more decorative historically, but they can be really fascinating. And this fusion of Norse magic with chaos magic is a field that you can really kind of dig deep and go down that rabbit hole if you want. So that is, Norse runes for spellwork in a nutshell. Obviously, there is a ton more details here that I haven't gone over, but I can see our Pagan Happy Hour is coming to a close. So thank you guys so much for sharing all your thoughts and ideas. If you did enjoy this Pagan Happy Hour, let me know, and because we could talk more about runes in a future Pagan Happy Hour if you're interested. This is really just kind of an intro. We talked about the history of runes, where they come from, how they were used historically, how they were used in the sagas, if they were used for divination, and then how you can use them for divination and spell work. So we really covered a lot here. I do hope you enjoyed this. If you did and would like to support this show, I highly recommend checking out my Discord community. It's the first link in my description box. That'll take you to my Patreon. If you choose to become a Patreon of me and this channel, the lowest tier is $5, and then you gain immediate access to the Discord community, which is where we talk about this stuff all day long every day. So if that's your cup of tea and you're looking for a pagan community and you want this conversation to continue and dig even deeper into the runes and other aspects of paganism, definitely check that out. And thank you guys so much for joining me. I really hope you found this valuable. I worked really hard on this one. I wanted to give you guys a lot of good information about runes, and be sure to comment what topics you would like me to cover next, because the next Pagan Happy Hour is, only 7 days away. So it'll give me some time to do a little research and pick a good topic for you for next Friday. So thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you guys next Friday.